The number of adults with diabetes in the U.S. has more than doubled in the last 20 years.
A grim warning tonight for Australians with type 2 diabetes.
A new analysis of medical data from around the world indicates that 1.3 billion people could be living with diabetes by 2050.
How did we get here? And what if I told you this wasn't an accident? 40 years ago, someone who was obese or had type 2 diabetes was an outlier. So is it genetics? Lack of exercise? Too much red meat? Today we're going to discuss how seemingly unrelated events have conspired to give us today's obesity and diabetes epidemic. We're going to break down how different players from corporations, government agencies, and other organizations have created the health crisis we're living in now. And if you're suffering with type 2 diabetes, obesity, or both, there is hope. But more on that later in the video. This is religious zealot Ellen G. White. Ellen was born November 26, 1827. From the age of 16 and the subsequent 20 years, Ellen experienced visions from God. During one of these visions, it was revealed to Ellen the importance of taking responsibility for your own health. The vision went on to show Ellen that the important part of health was a vegetarian diet. From there, Ellen went on to write hundreds of books, some specifically around the importance of eating correctly. Very good with time management, Ellen also used her time to co-found the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ellen's writings and the Adventist Church have been pivotal in selling the message of a plant-based diet, even today. And you're not going to believe the connections and influence that Ellen and the Adventist Church have had on the rest of the players we're going to meet today. This is John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg was brought up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In fact, Ellen G. White was pivotal in Kellogg's decision to attend medical school. In 1876, Kellogg was put in charge of a resort which advocated the health principles of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. This was the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan. Turns out, Mr. Kellogg was a fan of bland food. Along with Ellen G. White, Kellogg believed that bland food was a way to minimize excitement, arousal, and masturbation. And so a lot of Kellogg's subsequent work went into developing these bland, non-meat foods. In 1877, he created granola, and in 1894, he developed cornflakes. Little did Kellogg know that he would be pivotal in world history and in shaping the world literally over 100 years later. And so at this point, you can see the beginnings of the ultra-processed food industry. Cheap to produce, refined food. Food that is digested quickly and leads to a rapid rise in blood sugar and insulin, skyrocketing sugar consumption, and the onset of type 2 diabetes. This is Ancel Keys. In the 1950s, he began a study into coronary heart disease funded by the US Public Health Service. His 7-country study showed that countries with a higher saturated fat consumption correlated with higher levels of heart disease. There are 2 problems with this study. Number 1, because Ancel Keys collected data on 22 countries, but chose to only publish the study on 7. Conveniently, countries like France were excluded. Why? Because it would have messed up the results.
Your Honor, I object!
And why is that, Mr. Reed?
Because it's devastating to my case!
Overruled.
If your study is designed to prove that higher saturated fat consumption leads to heart disease, you don't want a pesky country involved that has a high saturated fat consumption and low rates of heart disease. As you can see here, the graph looks a little bit different when all 22 countries are included. Problem number 2, this study had a massive influence on public health. Once the study was published in 1970, there was a huge worldwide push to control saturated fat intake, which is a boon for companies like Kellogg's, whose business it is to produce low saturated fat, ultra-processed, bland food. With saturated fat effectively demonized, The era of low-fat, high-sugar, ultra-processed foods is on our doorstep. So as you can see, we've now got quite a few direct and indirect links between the players. You've probably heard of Harvard. In the 1960s, 3 Harvard researchers were paid to do some research. The research suggested there were major issues with any studies implicating sugar in health concerns. And the reality was that fat was actually the culprit. The big problem with this research is that the funding, or the payoff, came from the sugar industry, the Sugar Research Foundation. The even bigger problem is that it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and so it was taken seriously. And so the corrupt science continues to shape the perception the public have about fat versus sugar. So we have Ellen G. White and the Seventh-day Adventist Church promoting a plant-based bland foods diet. We have John Harvey Kellogg producing bland foods which are highly processed carbohydrate. In other words, sugar. We have Ancel Keys convincing the public and policymakers that saturated fat is the problem and causing coronary heart disease. And we have the sugar industry paying off Harvard researchers to say sugar is good for you, fat is bad. And there's more. President Richard Nixon. In the early 1970s, President Nixon was dealing with rising food prices and inflation. His Secretary of Agriculture tried to stabilize prices by encouraging production of commodity crops. One of those commodity crops being corn. He introduced generous subsidies for corn production, which led to a massive oversupply. But this oversupply happened at a very convenient moment. Food manufacturers were on the lookout for a cheap cane sugar alternative. And corn's versatility meant that it could be processed into high fructose corn syrup. As a result, sugar consumption increased dramatically in the form of high fructose corn syrup. But this was okay because remember, Ancel Keys had already informed the public that the problem was saturated fat, not sugar. And if you were still in any doubt, don't worry, the sugar industry and Harvard had made clear that sugar was not the problem. But there's more. In 1917, the American Dietetic Association was founded by Lena Francis Cooper and Lulu Graves. The American Dietetic Association is responsible for a lot of the dietary advice you get through the mass media and from your doctor. One of the founders, Lena Francis Cooper, was a member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and brought her teachings about a plant-based diet with her. Additionally, Adventist institutions like the Battle Creek Sanitarium and later Loma Linda University provided much of the education for dietitians. I'm running out of string for most of these connections. Now on to big food. The food industry took its lead from Kellogg and similar pioneers. Ultra-processed food was cheap to produce, had good margins, and it fit into the model of low fat promoted by Ancel Keys and our Harvard researcher friends. To help with all this, it needed to be made clear to the public that fat bad, sugar good, which is where calories come in. In the early 1800s, Nicholas Clement introduced the term calories for the measurement of heat energy as it relates to steam engines. Later that century, the food industry realized that calories would be a good measurement for food. It meant that consumers would have this easy way of comparing different foods together and understanding the difference in energy. And as saturated fat typically has more measurable energy, this worked really well for a food industry pushing low-fat products. Quick sidebar, calories is a ridiculous way of measuring and comparing food. Measuring calories involves exploding a sample of the food and measuring the temperature change. And when you think about it, this is of course a terrible way of comparing foods, because your body doesn't work that way. Your body doesn't explode the foods you consume. Your body extracts nutrition from that food. Cool, looks like 100 calories there. Also, to believe that calories is a valid measurement is to believe that 100 calories of chocolate is equivalent to 100 calories of salad or 100 calories of steak. There is almost zero nutrition in chocolate and a potentially high blood sugar spike. So comparing on calories is like assessing the nutritional value of food based on length or color. But it works well for big food because it's simple for consumers to do a comparison. It's simple for consumers to think they're doing the right thing. And it's helped big food to get consumers to treat ultra-processed foods the same way they would treat whole foods. Everything's equal, just count the calories. And this brings me to big pharma. The pharmaceutical industry has provided us with life-enhancing and life-extending medications like antibiotics. And every year more and more drugs are developed and enter clinical trial. Trouble is, those drugs are developed in a vacuum. Those drugs are developed to treat a symptom. Have high cholesterol? We've got a drug for that. High blood pressure? We've got a drug for that. Chronically elevated blood sugar? We have all the drugs for that.
My brain hurts! It'll have to come out! Out of my head! Yes! All the bits of it!
So when you've got some problem, you go to the doctor, and instead of looking into the problem and trying to address the root cause, the doctor gives you a medication for the symptom you're experiencing. And the result? You get sicker and sicker because the real root cause problem was never addressed. Why address that chronically elevated blood sugar when you can continue eating the carbohydrates you love and just take insulin to balance things out? Here's how the pieces of this puzzle fit together. And the end result is more of the same. More obesity, more diabetes, more fatty liver disease, and more young people getting sick earlier and earlier and earlier. We've been misled for decades, and it's no wonder we're looking at more type 2 diabetes, more obesity, and more chronic disease. But there is something you can do about it.
As of today, as of 5 hours ago, I am off 100% of my diabetic medications.
My A1C down to 5.7 is like right at the edge of pre-diabetes. I brought it down to that within 6 months from 9.8.
And he tests my A1C and he's like, it's 4.5. And I told him, I said, well, last August my A1C was 12.6. And you could see this look on his face, Dave, of confusion. He was like,
With the type 2 diabetes, I don't take any diabetes medication anymore because my blood sugar's in check.
So that's effectively, it's gone.
It's gone.
It's time to take control of your health. Watch this video next.